approach to the history of healing in the later Middle Ages, focusing on the intersection of medicine and religion. She teaches courses on epidemics in the pre-modern world, magic, medicine, and miracle, and she's published essays on the emotional impact of war in the 14th century, and testimonies about early waves of plague found in canonization inquests. Like, all of this is so interesting. I want you to talk about every single one today. She's published several articles on fascinating topics like these, but she's currently working on a book-length project called Souls Under Siege, Plague, War, and Spiritual Anxiety in the 14th Century, that explores 14th century testimonies about surviving mercenary invasion, epidemic, and the spiritual anxiety surrounding confession. So we're very happy to have you. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to speak to your lunch bunch. I'm very excited to be here. I'll be talking about a few of these issues, plague and war, today, but I'd actually like to consider the healthcare practitioner. I'm using this phrase that's a modern phrase and taking it back into the Middle Ages, and I've changed one of the terms up here. I had healthcare provider and realized that just opened an avalanche. That was just way too big of a topic, so I narrowed it down to practitioners. So I'll just be talking about practitioners today and lessons that we can consider from medieval miracle accounts. As I prepare for trips in winter and spring, I always consider getting a flu shot. And I know we've all read in the New York Times saying that, oh, they're not helpful this year, or oh, they're really good this year. I spend time on airplanes and in airports, and they make me want any protection I can get, against these microbes. The nearest place to me to get a flu shot is a drugstore called CVS. And every time I consider getting a flu shot there, I hesitate. It feels strange considering getting a shot, something that punctures my skin, in a store where I also buy shampoo. And to receive this shot from a person who usually just gives me medicine that I take myself, someone that I used to think of profoundly and fairly as a pill company. And it all started making me think about the multiple roles that person in a white coat has, from everything from inoculator to cashier. And I started thinking more about what kind of practitioner this person was, who they treated, and how. As I thought about healing practitioners in my own experience, in this more flexible framework, it helped me reframe how I am thinking about practitioners in my research on the impact of plague and war in the 15th century. Let me say, however, that I am relatively new to framing my research in the language and ideas of history of science. The history of medicine even has been a relatively recent addition for me. I started out studying saints in order to see how people testify in canonization inquests. I'm particularly interested in language. But I found that mostly what people were talking about was suffering, illness, and healing. I've been drawn inexorably into trying to understand the history of healing from below, as Roy Porter puts it, through these testimonies and the kinds of knowledge that sufferers and practitioners testifying in canonization inquests had. Today I'll be looking at the healing practitioners and testimonies from one of the most interesting inquests I've ever worked with, the canonization inquest of Countess Delphine de Puy-Michel at. In thinking about the spectrum of healthcare practitioners, or practitioners with multiple roles, I'll contrast people identified as medicos or physicos in this inquest with those people who acted as what I call miracle mediators. I'm going to be very specific, miracle mediators. This second group of people who helped make miraculous or wondrous healing occur in available to others, almost always through body or contact relics, though I'm going to stretch those terms today, are an interesting group. These practitioners included everyone from family members to university-trained physicians, and included healers of illness of both body and soul. So my two main goals today are first to briefly look at the mediki, the doctors, especially a doctor named Master de Rondandre, who was described as a physicus in Delphine's inquest, but turned out to be a whole lot more. He was a cathedral canon, a confessor, and a medical doctor, and a miracle mediator. He testified as a witness in her inquest and was spoken about by other witnesses. Thinking about him in relation to other medical practitioners that appear in the inquest complicates any easy labeling of a practitioner by just thinking about the title they're given. His testimony, in which he described mediating a miracle, also lets us look at the range of methods a practitioner might use to address newly emerging distress and illness. Second, I want to look at other miracle mediators in the inquest to see if we can learn more about their knowledge of illness and their knowledge of the making and use of contact and body relics. This will help us consider them as part of a spectrum of healers in the 14th century and give us a chance to think about the concept of practitionership, which I'm starting out my talk with thinking about practitionership in the broadest sense, someone who practices an art discipline or vocation. Through the testimonies, we can see how miracle mediators made relics available, how they acted as healers, and we can see what they reveal about the spectrum of available healers. For many, their affiliation not only with Delphine, but also with two convents in Ath influenced their activity. Much like the pharmacists at CVS, who work in a place that sells everything from tequila to trash bags, but who are still knowledgeable in how to administer and distribute medicine. Some of these miracle mediators turned out to be quite knowledgeable about the body, health, and healing, even if they weren't in medicos, even if they weren't in a place that we consider a place of healing. So first of all, let me deal with my source so that we know we're all on the right page. First, the big question: why the canonization inquest? Why would we consider a canonization inquest? Most historians of medieval and early modern medicine have primarily used the writings of university-trained individuals, so treatises on medicine. For example, Monica Green studies the Trotula, which is women's medicine and gynecology. Louis Garcia Ballester studies the great master Arnaudo Villanova. Nancy Cerezi studied Taddeo Alderati. We look at these, the historians tend to like to look at the writings of specific doctors from the time. Historians have also used inquests for exploring medieval practices and practitioners. So historians who have used inquests for exploring medieval practices and practitioners have primarily used criminal inquests for their research. Here I'm thinking of people like David Gentlecourt, Joseph Schatzmiller, Michael Duval. And there are good reasons why they're using criminal inquests. Criminal inquests include names and practices, multiple views of how practitioners should practice, what procedures they should use, and they give interesting insight into expectations and practices of healing. Canonization inquests are different, however. They often require historians to recalibrate what they think of as illness, and they're different. They contrast interestingly to criminal inquests in that way. Illnesses of body and soul are equally important in witness testimonies and canonization inquests. And testimonies, of course, highlight the activity of the holy person. Rather than highlighting the activity of a criminal, they're highlighting the activity of a holy person or saintly person, since that's what's at question, since that's what the point is. The canonization inquest testimonies have a lot to offer for historians of medicine, particularly those looking at medicine from below, or how people in the Middle Ages thought about illness, health, and healing. Historians of medicine like Jacqueline Duffin and Iona McCleary have looked at medical knowledge and techniques as they appear in canonization inquest testimonies. Pierre-André Segal and Joseph Ziegler have looked at medical practitioners who testify in these canonization inquests. And finally, the emerging field of narrative medicine, I call it emerging, but some of you may be quite familiar with it for a long time, has highlighted the use of stories about therapeutic processes, encounters with practitioners, and illness experiences to better treat patients. So people who are using narrative as a healing tool. But like any historical source, canonization inquest testimonies are not transparent windows into the past. We need to contextualize and understand these sources to use them effectively. So I'm going to spend a little time introducing my source, my specific canonization inquest, the canonization of Delphine de Puy Michel. in order to see what it can tell us about practitionership. And I have this slide up here. Delphine's inquest took place in a little town called Apt, which was a market town in the hills of southern France in Provence. It's about 60 kilometers from Avignon, which was the seat of the papacy in the 14th century. So it was the main bureaucracy of the Middle Ages was 60 kilometers away from this little town, which makes it an interesting place, as I'll explain. By the 14th century, canonization inquests were extensive legal procedures conducted by the papal court to determine if a local holy person should be an official saint for the entire Catholic Church. Since miracles, most often healing miracles, were a necessary part of sanctity and local faith, canonization inquests can be a treasure trove of illness and wound descriptions, since there were so many healing miracles in them. As each witness came before the papal commissioners, they testified to one or more miracles, and they described fevers, tumors, stomach fluxes, dropsy, mental illness, difficult childbirth, skull fractures, leprosy, blindness, deafness, paralysis, just to name a few things that he got up and described in these testimonies. They described acute illnesses and sudden injuries. They described chronic illnesses, which they had endured for years. They described spiritual, emotional, and demonic illnesses. While many of the witness testimonies were simple statements that the witness saw the person ill with the said illness, saw them healed for a significant period of time, other testimonies include far more information. Some witnesses described treatments like baths or herbs that they tried. They named doctors or healers that they visited and the prognosis given. And some witnesses described their conditions in detail. And as they did so, they revealed their own knowledge of symptoms and progression of illness. In contrast to other kinds of sources that we have for miracles, things like saints' lives or miracle collections, which were often didactic in purpose. They were meant to teach people how to be better Christians. Canonization inquests were places where people were expected to perform their own knowledge. Witnesses were expected to perform their knowledge. They were trying to show papal representatives their knowledge of the holy person, their knowledge of the miraculous. Because so many miracles concerned healing, they also performed their knowledge of illness and healing. What becomes clear after reading just a few revealing testimonies is that these were not passive sufferers begging God for healing. These were people actively involved in their own and others' health care. And they were people who had health care options, both inside the home and outside. In the home, family members, especially mothers, guided family care through their own knowledge and networks. Family members performed procedures, made suggestions to the sick about healing options, negotiated access to relics, organized visits to medical doctors, and made vows to saints. Options outside the home included local and distant doctors or institutions that might provide care or at least protection, like hospitals, hospices, or convents. While testimonies can give us useful information, we must read them cautiously and remember their context. Witnesses and inquest organizers were doing many things at once in these highly legal procedures that were the canonization inquest. The desire for the money of pilgrim traffic and the prestige of having a saint in one's lineage or one's town are just two examples of pressure that might have shaped witness testimony. But I still tend to agree with Michael Gurlich, who's one of the main historians who studies canonization inquests. And he explained in his essay, Social History and Medieval Miracles, that inquest testimony, if used cautiously, is one of the best resources historians have to move from the pious generalities of hagiography to the circumstances of a particular miracle and its social climate. So we have a sense of the general genre of the canonization inquest. Let me talk about Delphine's inquest in particular. There are three elements that make Delphine's inquest particularly useful for looking at the spectrum of healers, and especially miracle mediators. First of all, time and location, the witnesses themselves, and the questioning procedure. These three things were incredibly useful in Delphine's inquest, and they're quite unique. Let me go through each one really quick, starting with time and location. Historians have long argued that war and epidemic during the 14th century shaped demography, economic trends, and spiritual concerns for centuries. Delphine's inquest took place in 1363. This was after 2 waves of plague and at the height of mercenary invasions of the Rhone Valley, triggered by the 100 Years' War. Every witness in Delphine's inquest had lived through what we come to think of as the watershed year of 1348, the first wave of plague. Some witnesses refer to this as the primum mortalitatem, the first mortality, and they used it to date other events in their lives. Some of them talked about it directly, but mostly they used it to date other events, sort of like we might say, oh, that was before 9/11, or oh no, that was the year after 9/11, as we put these things in context. Every witness had also lived through a second wave of plague in 1361. And this one they described much more directly. It was much more fresh in their minds, and they described the tumors and the fevers and the people that they saw healed by the saints. The witnesses in her inquest also talk about waves of mercenary invasion, starting in 1357. In the first wave that occurred in 1357 and 1358, mercenaries under the leadership of a man named Arnaud de Serval, aka the Archpriest of Velin, who was one of the most successful military leaders, or mercenary leaders in the 100 Years' War. He came into the region and attacked cities like Marseille and Aix. So the mercenaries came from this southern region, moved all the way across the Mediterranean, and then moved into this area. It'd be very helpful if the Rhone actually showed up on this map. So there would be a nice little blue line here, if it were kind enough. The mercenaries took roughly 15 cities in the region of Provence, so the region around Avignon and Aix-en-Provence. Here's a close-up of that region. Several right around Apt. So we have Apt in the center, and mercenaries were taking cities like this and using them as strongholds to then attack everybody in the area, making it incredibly difficult to travel. Witnesses spoke of devastating ambushes that killed local lords, and of living in fear of something called escalade, the practice of mercenaries who would scale the walls on moonless nights or during storms, and then open the gates of the city to their compatriots. So there's a great miracle in Delphine's inquest where people are begging her to save them because there's a massive storm, and the people standing on the walls can't see one another. They can't see from one person to the other, so they can't make sure no one's scaling the walls. After the Treaty of Bretigny, however, the truce between England and France, which occurred in 1360, brought this treaty essentially brought tens of thousands of unemployed mercenaries into the Rhone Valley because of the Avignon papacy being the papacy being in Avignon, with being the wealthiest bureaucracy in Europe at the time. This was the place to attack. I mean, this was the center of a massive tax making, a massive taxation center, and so there was huge amounts of money traveling through there and people traveling to and from that they could then capture. So we see that both time and place mean that these people are experiencing things that no one else is in many ways in anywhere else in Europe, especially with the great companies. And the testimonies that people have, particularly the testimonies by women, are some of the only, are some of the best non-literary sources that we have of these events. The witnesses themselves also, the second category, so now that we have a sense of time and place, the second category of witnesses made Delphine's inquest incredibly important. As a group, the witnesses were wealthy, frequently well-traveled, and often politically well-connected to the papal court and the crown of Naples, which were the overlords of Provence at this time. It wasn't part of France. The witnesses or their family members were often directly involved in peace efforts, in fighting the mercenaries, or in helping people during waves of epidemic. Unlike other inquests where noble witnesses were represented by surrogates, important witnesses in Delphine's inquest testified in person. Such people as the Bishop of Avignon, several cardinals, noble women testified themselves in her inquest. And perhaps due to their social status, they were not intimidated by the papal commissioners in the same way as those of lower status might have been. Witnesses respected the inquest process, but they were not overawed and they were not easily led in their testimony. Another aspect that makes witnesses different in Delphine's inquest from others is that they knew Delphine well. Delphine lived to be 75, and she spent most of her later years in convents and hermitages in Provence. Most of the witnesses had known her all their lives. They described talking with her on the way to Mass, discussing issues of theology with her, hearing her speak during meal times, and seeing her impact on young people in convents and local families. Other Provençal canonization candidates, like Saint Louis of Anjou here in Luxembourg, or even Delphine's deceased husband, Saint Elzéar de Sabran, had only lived into their 20s and 30s. They traveled frequently, so they didn't set down roots in any one place, and they often had few associates. Few people had very specific, detailed stories to tell about them. But Delphine, people knew her. They had known her all their lives. And finally, the last element that makes her inquest truly special is questioning. The questioning procedure of Delphine's inquest really allowed witnesses to speak fully about their pursuit of healing and the practitioners they turned to. To understand this, let me back up just a little bit and give a little context for canonization inquest process. If the papal court accepted a person as a candidate for canonization, papal commissioners and at least one papal notary traveled to the holy person's city, where they joined local officials and at least one local notary. The commissioners questioned witnesses about the candidate's life and miracles. The testimonies were written down by the notaries, translated into Latin as needed, and all of the materials were collected and sent back to the papal court for further deliberation. As part of the questioning procedure, witnesses were read a series of articles of interrogation. These had been common since the 13th century. These were statements about the holy person's life and miracles that summarized major aspects of his or her sanctity. In Delphine's inquest, unlike others from the 14th century, these articles started with an open-ended question that asked witnesses to tell the commissioners anything they knew about Delphine, her life, her living miracles, her posthumous miracles. Also, unlike other inquests in which some witnesses were asked about a holy person's life and others were asked about the miracles, every witness in Delphine's inquest had the opportunity to answer this open-ended question, as well as every other question in the inquest. So everybody who stepped up there, all 70 people, were asked, tell us everything you know about Delphine. Many witnesses took this up. Many witnesses took the opportunity to tell long, detailed stories about themselves and their relationship to Delphine. So we get these fabulously detailed stories. Okay, now that we know what we're dealing with in terms of canonization inquest and Delphine's inquest, let's get to the practitioners and see what we have. Many witnesses, as I said, described actively pursuing medical care, both from physicians and from others who made medicines or administered treatment before receiving a miracle. In Delphine's inquest, witnesses identified 15 men by name as physicus or medicus. I don't know how well you can read that from where you're sitting, but we have the question. Most of these practitioners were identified as local, from Apt or from nearby towns. So here I have the name of the person, a summary of the information provided, and the number of witnesses who talk about them. What has come to be called the despairing doctor trope. I went to doctors and they despaired of my life, and so I had to go to the saint. But this has come to be called the despairing doctor trope. Appears in Delphine's inquest. But historians increasingly see this not as the effectiveness of doctors or a critique of doctors, but as medical doctors in the 14th century doing exactly what they're supposed to do. Not give false hope and not claim to be able to heal things that they can't. So we're seeing this evidence not of doctors as failures, but as acting appropriately. Of the testimonies that included, of the witness testimonies that included mention of specific doctors, only 2 were openly negative. 2 witnesses explained that Johannes and Giorgio de Sanion in Avignon charged so much for medical care that it was too expensive, even for the relatively wealthy. We don't have any poor people in Delphine's inquest. These are wealthy people. So for them not to be able to afford it, it's quite extreme. Rather than critique doctors, most witnesses sought to show the inquest commissioners that they had tried medical care and followed the prescriptions and advice of doctors fully before turning to Delphine for miraculous healing. Some witnesses also described people who made medicine and administered treatment but were not identified as medicus or physicus. These descriptions have a very different valence than we tend to see in criminal inquest testimonies. And they show the positive side of makers of medicine and these administrators of medicine. I'm going to bring up 3 really quickly. First is Alessazia Messalano. She's a draper's widow living in Apt. She was about 50 when she gave her testimony. She described administering treatment to herself by binding her hand, which had a livid tumor. She did this after she sought medical treatment, and it was unsuccessful. Second, I give you the example of Raymond of Ansuisse, who was a priest in Marseille. He described being given a clyster by a woman brought to the monastery where he was being treated during the second wave of plague in 1361. He tells us little about this event, except that it was unnecessary, because he had already made a silent vow to Delphine and felt that he was being cured by Delphine when he was given this treatment. And finally, Bertranda Bartolomeo, who was in her 60s when she testified. She testified from her bed. She was too sick to get up, so the whole group went to her bedside. And she had been Delphine's maid for over 40 years, so she had quite a lot to say. She testified that King Robert of Naples had made medicine for a noblewoman in his court who was suffering a fever. She doesn't go into detail, but it's a fantastic detail about the King of Naples. While none of these efforts were successful, they add to the sense of the many kinds of people and treatments available to the sick, and that these other treatments were not antithetical or separate from one another. You could try lots of different things, pretty much all at once. I'd like to take a moment and look at one particular doctor, number 5 up here, Master Durand André. Part of his testimony, one of the men identified as physicist, number 5 here, defies easy categorization, as I've said. He was a close associate of Delphine for the last 10 years of her life and wore many hats in the community of Apt. He was a cathedral canon, one of Delphine's confessors, and a medical doctor to Delphine, her ladies, and other people in the community of Apt. He testified at length about his efforts to care for Delphine's body and her soul. Now, I don't have a picture of him, but I do have a notarial record, him appearing in a notarial record from the city. So I'll put that up there as a representation that he actually existed. He testified at length about his efforts to care for Delphine's body and soul. And part of his testimony looks beyond Delphine's health and shows how he experienced Delphine's miraculous healing and then made that miraculous healing available to lots of other people. This part of his testimony this part of his testimony takes us away from physical health and explores what we might consider mental health in the form of anxiety that people felt about their spiritual state in relationship to the sacrament of confession. Many witnesses, including Durand, recounted feeling transformative consolation after hearing Delphine speak. Her voice was a kind of oral body relic, something that poured out of her body that was less tangible than blood or milk, which are more usual in terms of relics, but it still touched and healed people. Witnesses said that her voice touched them inside, transformed them, and consoled their doubts of conscience. In his testimony, Durand André first described his own experience of Delphine's voice. He said that while Delphine was speaking healing words, he and several other men were moved in their hearts, and they were changed to penitence, contrition, compunction, and effusive tears. They began to suffer for their offenses to God. All the sins of their lives were restored to their memories as if they had all been written, and they felt a great desire to confess. Durand and these men experienced all the appropriate stages of a successful confession, nicely articulated by someone usually hearing them from other people. They changed on the inside, feeling penitence, contrition, and compunction, and their interior state showed on the outside through their spiritually cleansing tears. They suffered for their offenses, desired to confess, and most importantly for my talk today, remembered all of their sins as if they were written. This would have allowed them to make a complete, perfect confession. Durand's statement about memory implies a problem. The necessity of being aware of all of one's sins was an essential point for 14th century confession. The soul could be damned even for sins you didn't remember, since this constituted an incomplete or imperfect confession. Confessors and preachers knew about the problem that memory posed and urged people to confess more frequently than the once-a-year minimum. Preachers also highlighted poor memory as one of the dangers of waiting until you were on your deathbed to confess. Durand's experience of Delphine's voice revealed a solution to the memory problem that anyone who was trying to make a complete confession faced. A surprising number of witnesses in Delphine's inquest described experiences interfering with the sacrament of confession. These included not only memory problems, but difficulty speaking when one is near death, and the inability to change one's behavior while after one has confessed. Other witnesses, however, spoke in general about doubts of conscience and the inability of confession to alleviate their doubts. A few witnesses even described debilitating anxiety, desperation, and fear of damnation as a result of their inability to make a complete confession. The second part of Durand's testimony that I want to talk about sheds an interesting light on these problems. In it, he described helping sufferers with doubts of conscience receive a similar transformation to his own. Master Durand said that many men and women came to see Delphine. These visitors included religious and secular people. They came to see her act in Avignon and in other places. They came in small groups. They came in large groups up to 20. These men and women asked Durand to allow him to speak to Delphine for the health of their souls. They told him that they desired to be informed or instructed about their consciences and to be assured about their doubts of conscience. He and many others used the word certificati, which I'm translating here as assured, but it could also mean certified or guaranteed. They were guaranteed about the state of their souls. Durand introduced these people to Delphine and situated them in her presence in a group. They did not speak to her about their individual doubts of conscience. Instead, Delphine spoke general words to them. Sometimes she talked about saints' lives, vices and virtues, the 10 Commandments, very basic things. Master Durand said that she said generally instructive or edifying things to these audiences. Nothing special. After the discussion, sufferers left Delphine's presence, having been consoled of their doubts of conscience and assured. Though they never told her about their individual doubts, each one told Durand that it seemed that Delphine's words were for him or her alone. And when Durand asked them later why they didn't want to speak to Delphine, presumably individually, when they had wished to speak to her before, they told him that their doubts were sufficiently clear after the group encounter. Durand gives us a rare glimpse of a healing practitioner, a medicus, acting as a miracle mediator. Having experienced the positive effects of Delphine's voice and knowing, as a doctor and a confessor, the physical and spiritual damage that doubt and anxiety could cause, he took it upon himself to organize these group meetings. He then followed up with the sufferers, found that Delphine's voice and words had been effective. While Durand's testimony lets us think about him as a complex healing practitioner, it also lets us think about what kinds of health problems he was dealing with. It might be tempting to dismiss a testimony like this as not medical, because it's talking about anxiety and sadness surrounding confession, and it's talking about the soul. But if we dismiss this, we would miss important practical medical ideas of the 14th century. For physicians, such things as sadness, fear, anger, doubt, and anxiety were considered accidents of the soul, one of the 6 non-naturals. They were a basic component of Galenic medicine and a core piece of any healing regimen at the time. The 6 non-naturals were 6 things that influenced the health of the body, but weren't of the body. They weren't an organ, they weren't the hand, but they had an effect on the body. Through health regimens, doctors balanced individual sufferers' humors by manipulating what they ate, what kind of air they breathed, the amount of exercise they got, and the emotions they experienced. After 1348, plague regimens also became very popular. In these regimens, doctors urged people to leave infected cities in order to breathe uncorrupted air, to eat and drink very little so that they didn't have a bunch of things in their bodies that could be corrupted. But plague regimens also urged sufferers to avoid excessive fear and sorrow. For example, in Jacome d'Agramont's Regimen for Protection Against Epidemics, written in 1348, he wrote, "But among other influences that must be avoided in such times are especially those of fear and imagination, for from imagination alone can come any malady. No one, therefore, should give up hope or despair, because such fear only does great damage and no good whatsoever." According to d'Agramont, therefore, negative emotion and the process of imagination can be understood. The imaginatio can be both a place in the brain but also a process by which things that were not real could be generated. Imagination had the ability to cause physical illness. This view was expressed in other popular medical texts, like Bernard de Gordon's Lelio Medicina, and even literary works like Petrarch's Letters. At the same time, however, we shouldn't lose sight of those healing practitioners usually engaged in taking care of the health of the soul. These are people doing pastoral care, or confessors. Confessors considered anger, sadness, fear, and joy passions. They linked passions to bodily desires and made them sources of temptation and sin rather than sources of humoral balance or imbalance. However, pastoral care practitioners often use the analogy of sickness to talk about sin caused by the passions. This analogy appeared so frequently in medieval writing, including in texts for training confessors, that it became a common way of understanding vices. In Delphine's inquest, for example, witnesses described the sins of violence and vanity as sicknesses of the soul throughout the inquest, not just in Durand's testimony. Durand's testimony helps us see how a practitioner who practiced both medical and pastoral care experienced, understood, and tried to mediate the miraculous effects of Delphine's voice to heal sadness and anxiety caused by doubts of conscience. Perhaps because at this moment when death from plague and war were close, and people risked immediate damnation or extended purgatory, they were trying to manage the health of their souls more actively. Durand recognized the problem and found a solution that went beyond his training in either medicine or pastoral care, combined the two. The final category of healthcare practitioner I'd like to consider today are people not described as medicus or physicus, but who made and distributed relics. While Master Durand might have affected more people, he was not the only miracle mediator in Delphine's inquest. At least 12 individuals claimed to have or described someone who had made the miraculous healing occurring through Delphine available to others via contact or body relics. Again, sorry for the tiny print. No one title grouped these mediators together, but as we can see, they do have a few similar traits. It was mostly women. There's only Durand André, which I should add up here. Yeah, I should put him up here, even though he's manipulating her voice. But the chaplain of the Church of St. Catherine is the only man in there. It was mostly women, and many of them lived in or visited frequently the convents of St. Catherine and the Holy Cross in Apt, where Delphine frequently stayed after her husband died in the early 1320s. Almost all of these testimonies come from responses to that open-ended question, Article 1. The first question of the inquest, tell us everything you know about Delphine. Without that question, we would have learned almost none of this. While Master Durand fits the description of a practitioner relatively clearly, since he was given the title physicus and was engaged in both the art of medicine and pastoral care, these 12 individuals exist at the messy boundaries of the term practitioner. While they were not practicing what we might understand as an art, profession, or discipline, they were acting on their knowledge of a widely accepted form of healing and engaging that knowledge and the tools of that form of healing in order to heal others. These miracle mediators help us think about how relics do the work of healing and how people other than saints practice healing through miracle. I'd like to look at two testimonies, or the testimonies of two of these miracle mediators. The noble lady Reynarda Laguerre, number 5, and Lady Catherine de Puy, number 10, to consider elements of their testimonies that help us see them in the spectrum of healthcare practitionership. Let's start with the two miracles mentioned by Reynarda Laguerre. Reynarda was a 51-year-old Provençal noblewoman who recounted both of these experiences in her testimony to Article 1. In November 1360, Reynarda attended the vigil at the Church of St. Catherine on the night of Countess Delphine's funeral. For 4 days, Reynarda had been suffering a toothache and had pain in the left side of her jaw so severe that she couldn't eat. During the vigil, Reynarda took a ring from her purse and she gave it to a chaplain. He drew it through Delphine's feet and then returned it to Reynarda. She touched her cheek with the ring and was immediately healed. After telling the commissioners about that miracle, Reynarda described the miraculous healing of a nun at the convent of St. Clare in Arles, who had lost her ability to see clearly and could not read. Reynarda had given the convent in Arles what she called a sign of Our Father, which may have been a wreath or a statuette of some sort, that she had touched to Delphine's feet, perhaps during the vigil or on an earlier night. When the suffering nun touched her eyes with this sign of Our Father, she immediately saw clearly and read. After a few days, she returned the sign to Reynarda. In these two post-mortem miracles, we see Reynarda's knowledge of how to make contact relics, touch them to the Holy Body, and then use them for her own health and for the health of another. Reynarda knew that in general, the time between a holy person's death and his or her burial was an important moment for miraculous healing. She also knew that the vigil for a holy person was a special moment and afforded access to the body of the holy person. Put this up and I'll talk about it in a second. But Reynarda also had knowledge specific to Delphine's situation. She knew that many people had remarked on the wondrous preservation of Delphine's feet, which had remained pliable and lifelike after her death. Proof of God's witnesses considered this proof of Delphine's special relationship to God. During the vigil, this is a roughly late 14th century image of the vigil. During Delphine's vigil, during the vigil that Reynarda attended, several miracles occurred around Delphine's feet, including the internal transformation of a prostitute who kissed Delphine's feet, which is probably what's happening here. These two examples that Reynarda gave us show only limited evidence of Reynarda's practitionership. While Reynarda shared the contact relics she made, we don't get a sense that this was an organized or relatively large-scale process like we saw with Durand Andre helping lots of people in lots of cities. In terms of Reynarda's knowledge, the examples show Reynarda knew about making contact relics and knew about Delphine. We don't get the sense she knew much about blindness or toothaches. We also don't get the sense that Reynarda made relics as a discipline or an art. Making contact relics was available to almost anyone in the 14th century. Testimonies from other miracle mediators are more suggestive of practitionership, however, especially that of Lady Catherine de Puy, a 35-year-old woman and member of the local aristocracy of Provence who lived with Delphine at various times in convents and hermitages. Catherine testified in Article 1 that during the most recent Lent, her sister Isoarda, the young wife of Lord Laguerre of Gourd, suffered a fever that her close associates feared was hectic, likely meaning that it cycled through each day. These associates begged Catherine for something of Delphine's to cure Isoarda. Catherine gave them some of Delphine's hair to use, and then Isoarda and her associates left out. That same day, Isoarda experienced a sweat, and the fever inside her left. From then on, she was cured and healthy. After Catherine told this story, the commissioners asked her two interesting questions. First, they asked what kind of fever it was, and Catherine said she didn't know. This wasn't evidence of her ignorance of the kinds of fever, since she'd already used the specialized term hectic. It was instead evidence that she was being very specific about her knowledge in this inquest situation. Then they asked about the progression of the illness. They asked if, on the day that Isolde had the sweat, was she supposed to have had the end or the crisis of the fever anyway? So they're asking her what she knows about the process of this fever. Isolde replied that she did not know. Again, they had left out, so she wasn't sure. But she heard that Isolde had not had the sweat or the crisis before receiving the hair. So these questions were not standard in the inquest. Only a few witnesses were expected to know about the progression of the illness and specific language of fever in this way. She was one of only 2 or 3 people, and they were all women who discussed health this way. Catherine then told a second experience of miracle mediation immediately after being questioned about Isolde's experience. In this miracle, Catherine explained that she saw a partially deaf woman named Anastasia act. A doctor who had heard about Anastasia's illness sent the woman oleo umbrino to cure her illness, so a kind of oil. But when Anastasia heard about the success of Isolde using the hair of Delphine, she did not use the oil, but instead sent her daughter to ask Catherine for some of Delphine's hair. Catherine gave her the hair, and Anastasia got her hearing back. Catherine visited Anastasia one day later and perceived that Anastasia heard the words that Catherine was saying as she spoke. These stories reveal Catherine's knowledge not just of miracle and relic, but also of illness. Catherine used specific terminology of fever, and the commissioners asked her questions about fever. They asked few others. Catherine appears to occupy a different spot on the practitioner spectrum. While she did not heal as many people as Master Durand-André, her approach to healing had strong parallels. It included understanding symptoms and prognosis and following up with the sufferer after making a healing method available. Her testimony is an entry point for understanding the diversity of healing that lay people looked for in convents and monasteries. While lay people with connections to a monastery or convent obviously may have sought out and benefited from the institution's infirmary, they may also have gone for people's knowledge of and access to relics. Someone like Catherine, who made relics available but also had some knowledge of illness, may have had multiple functions in the broader community. Catherine's testimony is a good way to conclude my talk today. Sufferers in the 14th century had diverse healing options, including but not limited to medicine and miracle. These 2 healing options often required very different sets of knowledge for successful use, but the practitioners administering the kinds of health care could overlap, like Catherine de Puy seems to, and Durand-André definitely did. Or they might be quite separate, like the Jewish doctors that we saw. I didn't bring them up, but the Jewish doctors that we saw on the list, and someone like Renato Bulgari. Delphine's canonization inquest gave miracle mediators a chance to present their knowledge of miracle, medicine, illness, health, and healing to commissioners. The open-ended questions in particular let them choose what miracles to present and how to present the miracle and themselves. Some miracle mediators used the vocabulary of healers and healed multiple people, and some presented themselves as an extension of the whole person. Miracle mediators could be doing something that looked similar from the outside, but this opportunity to testify revealed interesting differences. It makes me think again about the drugstore pharmacist who trains to inoculate. Does this person see inoculation as just another form of distribution? Or is the pharmacist now a different kind of healthcare practitioner? I guess we'll have to ask them to find out. Thank you so much for your patience today.
We have a few minutes to have questions and discussion if you...
Sure, of course, that'd be great.
Some questions?
Let's talk everybody out.
What can you tell us about the commissioners? What can you tell us about their degree of medical knowledge, as far as you know, and what's the outcome of this conversation?
Okay, this is great, and I'll try not to go on and on and on. The commissioners for Delphine's inquest were the Archbishop of Aix-en-Provence and the Bishop of Sisteron. So they're pretty high up in the hierarchy of the church. They would be most likely educated at the university, so they might not have taken specific classes in medicine, but they would have a university education. And even just having a general education, they would know quite a bit about, as people who read, as people who have encountered a lot of texts, they would have a fair amount of knowledge. I don't think these particular people had acted as commissioners before in an inquest. but they knew the kinds of questions to ask, and you can tell from their questions that they had a fair amount of knowledge. They knew how to ask, for example, about what kind of fever was it? Was it this kind of fever? Was it that kind of fever? They knew what to expect in the answers. In Delphine's inquest, okay, I feel like I let everybody down at this moment. She wasn't canonized. She's still being considered. I know. She's still being considered. You could write in. I think the Pope is a little busy right now, but I think if you wrote in, you could. Let's see if we got the next one. See if the next one is interested in canonizing Delphine. But she was very engaged in her husband's canonization inquest, and he was canonized. So this was much more interesting to her. She was much more interested in getting her husband canonized. She wasn't so interested in becoming canonized herself. So she succeeded in what she had hoped to do, which was get her husband.
I guess I'm curious to know how important was it to have a physical cure of some kind, as opposed to what sounds to me like psychosomatic cures, in which Delphine seems to specialize.
Physical cures. So these miraculous healings, these were basic core evidence of God acting through the holy person. That this person had a special relationship and had this sanctity. These were mandatory and had been mandatory for since the beginning of the 12th century. So quite a while. This was a necessary piece. And by the 14th century, they didn't include every little tiny healing that might occur. They just included the big ones, things like resuscitating babies, healing the paralyzed, these kinds of things. Delphine's inquest is special because it does ask this open-ended question, and people tell us about little piddly things like toothaches. So it's kind of fun to see that that's still going on in the 14th century, but it has kind of dropped out of the official inquest. Yeah?
I want to make sure I understand that chart of the practitioners you showed us, the medicus. Those were people referred to, right,
Yes.
by the witnesses. Were any witnesses themselves, or? Yeah.
Yes, Duran Andre. So number 5, he gave an extensive testimony. So he was one of these people who testified. None of the other doctors, none of the other of these people would have, particularly the Jewish doctors, would never have been invited. But Duran Andre did, and the number of witnesses who refer to him is pretty high. So he's healed other people. Other people talk about him as their medical doctors.
And the way the commissioners ask the questions, is there any similarities to the way the kinds of follow-ups that you were talking about with Catherine's testimony? Is there similar kinds of follow-up questions to him, or?
Not really. Every once in a while, he would provide a lot of information about Delphine's physical health in certain situations. Particularly, there was a point at which she was crying so much in her later life that people worried she would either go blind or that it would start to affect her brain. And they interviewed him asked him quite a bit, because he was the medical doctor brought in to make sure there was that things were okay with her, and to try to get her to stop crying. And of course, they proved that this was the gift of tears from God. And as a confessor, he could say, "No, I'm sorry. These tears are a gift from God. I can't do anything about it." So he was uniquely placed to be able to recognize this gift of the doctor and a confessor. He has a really interesting testimony. Yeah.
Are there non-healing miracles as well
Yes.
in this inquest? And sort of what's the proportion, I guess I'm wondering, of the healing miracles versus other kinds of miracles?
It's probably about 98 to 2.
Really?
98% healing miracles and maybe 2% non. One of the main non-healing miracles is celestial music that everybody hears during her vigil. So they have no idea where it's coming from. They hear this just phenomenal music. It's beautiful descriptions of how music affects people in this kind of. It's quite lovely. But yeah, mostly they're almost all healing. Yeah.
How did the process come to be initiated?
Almost all of these canonization inquests, particularly by the 14th century, it required someone very politically connected to write to the Pope and get this started.
And who was that?
For Delphine, it was a guy named Cardinal Philippe de Cabasol, who had been an associate of the Pope for quite some time. And he was a friend of Petrarch, he was a friend of the King and Queen of Naples, He was he was the titular patriarch of Jerusalem. If any Christian power took over Jerusalem, he was the bishop of it. So he was an influential person, and also the Bishop of Avignon wrote for this. The Bishop of Avignon was Pope Urban V's brother. So one of the popes involved in her inquest was also, his brother was writing a letter saying, you need to pay attention to this woman. And they had both met Delphine at her husband's inquest. So they met her and were incredibly impressed with her as well, and nominated her for canonization right after she died. Usually it took a long time to get an official canonization, to get the papacy to allow this official inquest to occur. Hers occurred 3 years after she died.
How often would a husband and wife be up for?
I think they're it. I think these are the only two. Yeah, and their sanctity was so intertwined. I mean, their sanctity related so much to the other, especially her husband's to her. They had a chaste marriage, and she was the one who inspired him to be chaste and gave him this opportunity to have an epiphany from God. And so, yeah, their sanctity was so intertwined that when her husband got canonized, they just said, they linked the two of them together and created a double cult. And so they stopped pursuing her inquest because they felt like, oh, we don't need to. Her husband got canonized. We'll just link them together. And a lot of their saints' lives are double saints' lives. I mean, they just treat her as canonized right alongside her husband. So, yeah.
I wonder, then that leads me to our next question. I was thinking about Carolyn Bynum's work on this similar topics and how aware she makes us of the gendered components of these, and especially since you have a husband and wife who are having these inquests. Where do you see gender appearing in these documents that you have? What's gendered about the miracles, the testimonies? I don't know.
Where, and I don't approach gender in quite the same way that Carolyn Bynum does, but where I see gender really playing out in these is the chance that women get to speak. Because Delphine lived in multiple convents, the fact that she had so many women in her community, both lay women and religious women, they got to talk about their experiences in a different way than in other inquests that were happening at the time, which were mostly for men. Even the inquest for someone like Catherine of Siena, it's mostly men that testify. It's a lot of men that testify. This one, her maid, Bertranda Bartolomeo, not a noblewoman, not important in any way, has the longest testimony in this inquest. The entire group, like I said, the commissioners, everybody picked up, went to her bedside in order to talk to her and really see them coming to the fore of this. And it gives us this wonderful chance to create a parallel diagram. Here are these medicus, and then here are these miracle mediators.
What's interesting to me then is that it suggests that there's not a difference in the materiality of the medicals, or the hair, or the types of cures and things like that one would expect. That's interesting to me.
I don't know if I quite followed that, but
well, I wondered, in her husband's miracles, were they distributing the hair, or did the words, come into people's hearts? I mean, is there, is the kind of operations of the miraculous different for her as a woman than they were for her husband?
This breaks my heart, but his inquest is lost.
Oh.
I know! Oh my gosh,
I would have a great comparative.
Such a fabulous comparative. All we have is a summary.
Yeah. Okay.
So all we have is a list of the miracles.
Yeah.
We don't have any of this kind of information. But it just breaks my heart. Every time I work on it and I want to ask those questions, it's like, oh. It might still show up. It disappeared in the 19th century. So it might still be floating around out there, but it has not. And there have been multiple world wars, so there's a large chance it's gone. Yes?
Could you comment, excuse me, just a bit more about there was this wonderful image you had of the words in the mouth and then entering the ears, a kind of material transforming, and it was so evocative, but then you left, so I wanted to give you a chance to comment more on that as something that you're finding in other kinds of contexts. I'm thinking in the 17th century there's a lot of discussion of the word Puritan New England I know about, but it doesn't quite have this same sort of, there's something alchemical or whatever the way you describe it. So anyway, I just wanted to.
It evokes Christian Science, too.
I'm considering, because Delphine is most well known for her ability to transform people's hearts.
Yeah.
They hear her speak and their hearts are transformed in many different ways. I am considering her voice as a kind of relic. I'm stretching the definition of the body relic. Body relics are usually hair, fingernails, parts of the body, bones, those kinds of things. But milk and blood are also kinds of body relics, and I'm using her voice. I'm thinking of her voice as something that pours out of her and touches other people. I'm stretching it. Carolyn Bynum might look at me funny, but I think this is, because she's not saying anything new. She's not a mystic. She's not getting any visions from God telling her this is the real way to understand Scripture. She's not receiving any of this. Her husband was a mystic. She's not. She doesn't have ecstasies. She doesn't levitate. She doesn't do anything that the mystics do. She's firmly on the ground. But she does have, her voice has this power. It's the most popular article in her inquest is about her voice and hearing her speak. Over half of the witnesses in the inquest talk about it, describe somebody who's been transformed by it, and really bring this up quite a lot. So I'm creating this new category of relic.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Just a little brief one, which is, does the inquest happen after the Catholic Church bans trafficking human parts, like bones of martyrs and stuff like that?
Is it? Yes. Is it?
Yeah, and so
Okay.
the contact relics, excuse me, is there like a proliferation of these things? Stuff rubbed on people's feet or?
No, it definitely after the Crusades. As people are bringing back bits of St. Anthony, bits of all these different people that they now suddenly have access to, it becomes, it becomes
But
quite a
is there?
market.
But in terms of thinking of exchange and making commodification of like relics, I mean, are there more contact relics after this ban? Because if something touched someone, it's not the same as like somebody's finger or body part.
So are there more contact relics
more
after this?
sort of
I think there have just been contact relics all the time. I mean, this idea that you could touch something at a sacred site, or it's just constant. It appears in pilgrim testimonies just over and over and over. And there often are elaborate ways that you create it. So I don't know if it proliferates more. It just keeps on.
Well, we have one more. Actually, I have one more question. I saw your miracle mediators, and most of them were women. And we go back to the gender issue. Andre, whatever, so after she spoke to him, her voice went into him, and therefore he was able to use her voice to help other people.
I think what happens there is not so much that because he was transformed, he could then transform other people. I think what he was able to do is that he knew her.
Okay.
And so people came to him and said, I just need to talk to Delphine. And he'd say, okay. And then he'd bring a big group of people together, let Delphine talk, and they were transformed directly. So he was just a mediator. He was just kind of helping them out, making sure they got to see Delphine. It was very hard. She didn't want to talk to people. She did not want to heal people. She didn't want to have any part of it. She thought it was sinful that she could heal people.
Oh.
And so she did not want to participate. So he was the person that they were trying to get to first, to get to her.
Is that because she thought somehow that would detract from her husband?
It was because it would be sinful for her to say that she could heal people. It would be very prideful for her to go around touching people. This would be, she had to say this. She had to be the person saying, oh, no, it's evidence of a demon in me. It's not, it can't be God. She had to be very, very humble about it.
Well, let's thank...
Thank you so much.